Welcome back to the theory of motivation. I'm Dr. Reg Butterfield, talking to you about process theories of motivation. This is our third video of the series, and if you have not watched the introduction video, I strongly recommend you to do so, as it puts the whole subject of motivation into context. In our last video, the second of the series on motivation, we explained what process theory means. We then introduced in outline three examples of three process theories. These were expectancy theory, equity theory, and goal-setting theory. The remainder of the second video explored and explained Vroom's expectancy theory. Before watching this video, I suggest that you watch the second video if you haven't already done so. It introduced and explained what we mean by the term process theories of motivation. An important element of the expectancy theory that we examined in video 2 is that of perceived equitable rewards, known as valence. This notion of equity leads us to the next process theory of motivation, that of equity theory. I'm now going to explain the second process of motivation theory in our series, Adams' equity theory. So let's move into the theory and its application. John Stacey Adams' equity theory explains why pay and conditions alone do not determine motivation. It also explains why giving one person a promotion or pay rise can have a demotivating effect on others. When people feel fairly or advantageously treated, they are more likely to be motivated. When they feel unfairly treated, they are highly prone to feelings of dissatisfaction and demotivation. Employees seek to maintain equity between the inputs that they bring to the job and the outputs that they receive against the perceived inputs and outputs of others. The belief in equity theory is that people value fair treatment, which causes them to be motivated to keep the fairness maintained within the relationships of their co-workers and the organization. Words like efforts and rewards, or work and pay, are an oversimplification. Hence the terms inputs and outputs are logically what we give or put into our work. Outputs are everything we take out in return. The equity theory term inputs encompasses the quality and quantity of the employee's contributions to his or her work. Typical inputs include time, effort, loyalty, hard work, and many other types of input, including those shown here. Outputs in equity theory are defined as the positive and negative consequences that an individual perceives a participant has incurred as a consequence of his or her relationship with another. Outputs can be both tangible and intangible. Typical outputs are job security, esteem, salary, and many more, as the examples here indicate. Equity theory is a far more complex and sophisticated motivational model than merely assessing effort, as the inputs, and the reward, the outputs. Equity theory adds a crucial additional perspective of comparison with referent others, people we consider in a similar situation. Referent others are used to describe the reference points or people with whom we compare our own situation, which is the pivotal part of the theory. Equity does not depend on our input to output ratio alone. It depends on our comparison between our ratio and the ratio of others. We form perceptions of what constitutes a fair ratio of inputs and outputs by comparing our own situation with other referents. If we feel that inputs are fairly rewarded by outputs, then generally we are happier in our work and more motivated to continue inputting at the same level. If we feel, however, that our ratio of inputs to outputs is less beneficial than the ratio enjoyed by referent others, then we become demotivated in relation to our job and employer. Whilst money is not a motivator in itself, payment, however, is often seen as the major concern in organizations and therefore the cause of equity or inequity in most cases. In any position, an employee wants to feel that their contributions and work performance are being rewarded with their pay. According to equity theory, if an employee feels underpaid, then it will result in the employee feeling hostile towards the organization and perhaps their co-workers, which may result in the employee not performing well at work anymore. It's the subtle variables that also play an important role for the feeling of equity. Just the idea of recognition for the job performance and the mere act of thanking the employee will cause a feeling of satisfaction and therefore help the employee feel worthwhile and have more outcomes. In practice, this helps to explain why people are so strongly affected by the situations and views and gossip of colleagues, friends, partners, and so on, in establishing their own personal sense of fairness or equity in their work situations. Equity theory explains why people can be happy and motivated by their situation one day, and yet with no change to their terms and working conditions, can be made very unhappy and demotivated. If they learn, for example, that a colleague, or worse, an entire group, is enjoying a better reward to effort ratio. The comparative aspect of equity theory provides a far more fluid and dynamic appreciation of motivation than typically arises in motivational theories and models based on individual circumstances alone. Let's go through the complete comparative process once more to ensure that you understand it. A person compares their relationship between their inputs and outputs. If it is equal to that of the referent person, then it's okay. However, if it's either greater or less than that of the other person, then this perceived inequality creates tension in that person. This motivates the person to change something. The person may increase or decrease their level of input, amount of quality work or absenteeism, or working additional hours without pay. The person may try to change the outcomes, such as pay, working conditions, their status, and recognition, without changes to inputs. Whilst it's difficult for people to distort facts about themselves, it is possible within limits to distort the utility of those facts. For example, the belief about how hard they really are working, or the relevance of a particular qualification. A person might try to find a new situation with a more favourable balance, for example, by absenteeism, request for a transfer, resigning from a job or from the organisation itself. A person may bring about changes in others, for example, lower their inputs or accept greater outcomes, or the person may cognitively distort the inputs and outcomes of others. A person changes the referent group with whom the comparison was made. This is normally to make the comparison more relevant and viable, and not just to find an excuse for or rationalize the other referent differences. Having taken some action, the person then checks to see if the equity balance has been restored or not. This then repeats the cycle if the situation is still one of inequity. If equity is established, then the situation is stabilized and the person is once again motivated. The three primary assumptions applied to most business applications of equity theory can be summarized as follows. Employees expect a fair return for what they contribute to their jobs, a concept referred to as the equity norm. Employees determine what their equitable return should be after comparing their inputs and outputs with those of their co-workers. And third, the employees who perceive themselves as being in an inequitable situation will seek to reduce the inequity either by distorting inputs and/or outputs in their own minds or by leaving the organization. This brings our exploration of Adams' equity theory to a conclusion. In our series of videos so far, we have introduced the subject of motivation generally in video 1. In video 2, we explain the meaning of process theory, introduced 3 theories in outline, and explained in detail Vroom's expectancy theory. In this video, we have explained the second process motivation theory, Adams' equity theory. In our next video, video 4, we will explain Locke's goal-setting theory of motivation. Join me in exploring what is probably the most used model of motivation.